Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Georgetown and for participating in what we believe has already started as a quite exciting program for the afternoon and early evening. So we so appreciate the comments from Congressman Morrison. And now we're going to hear from the young folks. I'm sorry, he's left us, I think, from the younger folks. So I'm going to just very briefly introduce them because probably many of you have already Googled them, so you already know more about them than possibly they know about themselves. First place, I'll very briefly tell you about each one of them and then tell you what I think are some themes across them. So Francesca Drum was born in Belfast, just about the time of the Good Friday Agreement.
Yep, just 4 months after.
So timely. She's currently, we are very happy to say, a student in the Walsh School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown and will graduate in 2021. And she's majoring in international politics. She's already had a quite distinguished career, which is a bit interesting to think about. And so she's been, for example, a youth advocate with the Children's Law Center in Belfast and has led a youth inquiry to government and has spoken at the United Kingdom Youth Parliament. She was also named the 2017 Young Global Changemaker. So we're looking forward to your change, not just in Ireland, but globally. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Okay. We hope.
And importantly, she also works with the Berkley Center, whose sign you can see there, and about whom Gerard told you. And Clara Rumsa was born a bit before the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah.
Was a bit more than a toddler, we learned, when it was passed. She was also born in Dundrum, I'm sorry. And importantly, she's director of leadership programs for the Washington, Ireland program. And we're hoping that you'll say a bit about the program. And before that, she was actually a participant in the WIP in 2004, I think. And she has a degree in law and politics from Queen's University in Belfast and a master's degree in international development from UCD, University College Dublin. Matt Torney is also from Belfast and born before the Good Friday Agreement, right? I'm trying to set a context here. So he has a wonderful history. He's really been involved in the arts and primarily in theater.
That's right, yeah.
And in Dublin and in Washington, D.C., and in Northern Ireland as well?
Yes, I've directed a few productions in Northern Ireland. Yeah.
So we're hoping to hear from him about engagement of the arts and politics as well. So there's, I think, some really interesting themes across their experience. One is that they were all engaged both in Northern Ireland and globally, and are very involved not just in politics, but across sectors, which is increasingly important. And the theme, as you know, for this session is not just the past, but looking toward the future, and to perceptions of youth about the Good Friday Agreement itself, and also what it means for the future of Ireland, and more generally. And one of the interesting foci is that each of them has been involved really in what we now think of as peace building. And so it's not just reaction to violence, which is sort of an old-fashioned way of thinking about these things, isn't it? It's really looking to peace building and engagement broadly and to contributions. So I wonder if we could hear from each of you about your ideas about the Good Friday Agreement and about peace during your all too brief lifetime so far, and the direction of the future.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Professor Jolson, for your introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here today, and thank you to the organisers of this event for inviting me to speak. As Professor Jolson noted, I am part of the Good Friday Agreement generation, the generation of peace born just 4 months after the signing of the agreement. So at age 19, I have never experienced the violence and the warfare that plagued Northern Irish society in the years before. For example, I went to an integrated school. I had friends from both the Protestant and the Catholic community, and I've never felt that the political belief I subscribed to, the religious belief I held, or the school I went to played a burden upon my future. So I've grown up in a thoroughly modern, and you could even say a normalised Northern Irish society, witnessing the divergence from a territorial, sectarian lines of the past to a community of cohesion and of peace. And on another level, as a child of the agreement, I could never have imagined that I would now be attending the same institution attended by two of the key guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, namely, obviously, President Bill Clinton, but also Senator George Mitchell. So I credit much of the personal peace and progress that I've experienced, as well as the larger social, cultural and political transformation in Northern Ireland, to the landmark Good Friday Agreement. And I think, as Professor Jolson noted, it's important not only to look back to 1998 and to remember and to reflect on its influence, but also to renew our commitment to the principles made in 1998 under the Good Friday Agreement. But first, on the need to remember, I think there's no doubt that the Good Friday Agreement was a monumental peace accord that brought not only the disarmament of the physical weapons of war, but that transcended into the emotional, the social and the psychological, in the sense that it broke down barriers and walls that in the years past had not only impeded dialogue, but also development really in Northern Ireland. And so brick by brick, with the creation of a mutually constitutive and consociational form of democracy, the us versus them attitude in Northern Ireland began to erode. And we saw how politicians who were previously diametrically opposed to each other began to work together, and a trust was built between citizens. There was a surmounting of bridges and an allowance and a room for differences, in particular a room for an expansive Britishness and an expansive Irishness as coexisting and not competing identities. And so in many ways I was very lucky. I grew up in a Northern Ireland where, although without doubt discrimination had not dissipated completely, but society began to learn to value individuals as individuals alone and not in terms of their religious or their political affiliations. So I remember the power of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, but right now I think it's essential that we renew the influence and the power, the relevance of the Good Friday Agreement, and in particular in this time of political instability in Northern Ireland. On a personal note, I cast my first legal vote in the Northern Ireland Assembly elections in March 2017. And I did not know when I cast my vote that that would be the last sitting government at Stormont and executive. And it's been 15 months since I cast that first ballot and that first vote. And in that period, I have really seen a return, I feel, to the partisanship and polarisation of Northern Irish politics. And a retreat to the ideological silos of nationalism and unionism, Protestantism and Catholicism. So this, coupled with the ever-growing burden of Brexit and legacies such as the Irish Language Act, they are going to influence not only the future of democratic growth in Northern Ireland, but also the future of the Good Friday Agreement. And so I feel now more than ever before, it's time to revisit and renew our commitment to the Good Friday Agreement. I think what must be understood is that the Good Friday Agreement was never meant as a final settlement. It did not guarantee peace, but it made it possible. It had a mechanism for resolving future differences. And in what many people had characterised as impossible and intractable conditions for peace, it secured majority rule, individual rights, the rule of law, and the end to violence and shared powers, as well as shared economic rights. What's more, there's research just here from the Georgetown Institute of Women, Peace and Security, and it says that more than 50% of peace agreements end within 5 years. And just last Tuesday, the Good Friday Agreement celebrated its 20th birthday. So I feel the Good Friday Agreement is a clear success, and we must build on this success and the peace and the progress that has been made in the past 20 years, and not allow this to be replaced by the politics of tribalisation, territorial demands and Trojan horses that we've seen. And there's a quote by the great Irish playwright and poet W.B. Yeats, and he says that peace comes dropping slow. But that doesn't mean that our efforts to forge peace should come dropping slow. I feel that this work is as urgent now as it has ever been, because there is more to lose now than there has ever been. There are still wounds that haven't been healed, where the pain and loss of those most personally connected to the conflict still resonates. And often time doesn't lessen this debt, it only compounds it. As has been noted before in the previous panel, segregated schools and communities still exist. And in particular, only 7% of young people in Northern Ireland are educated in an integrated education setting. There are wards of Belfast that have the highest levels of deprivation in Europe. There are peace walls and there are borders that still stand, and there are many miles still to go. So overall, if we're reflecting on the ecstatic highs that we felt in April 1998, looking back and now looking forward in April 2018, I don't think it's what the guarantors envisioned for society in Northern Ireland. But I guess really what I want to restate is that I'm not cynical, I'm not pessimistic, and I have hope for Northern Ireland. My life is very different from those of my great-grandparents who lived under Irish partition and fought for equality in 1922. Or my mother, she started her career at the most bombed hotel in Europe, the Europa Hotel in Belfast. Wow. So I've seen also how my generation, the Good Friday Agreement generation, are coming of age. I believe that we have a clear-eyed realism, but also an optimistic idealism. What's more, we have a model and a blueprint for peace, and that's something that our predecessors before us did not have. They took the first steps towards peace, and these are often the ones that require the most courage and are the hardest. And now it's the job of my generation to continue in this journey. We are keenly aware of the world as it is, but we also have a vision of a world as it should be. And I believe that we're some of the most politically engaged bunch of young people that I know. So really what I'm saying is, while we have our unique reasons to be hopeful, we also have our unique challenges to face. But we are the first generation to inherit more than the hardened attitudes and the bitter prejudices of the past. So I guess in reflecting on all of this, I'd like to look at the words of the great poet Seamus Heaney, and he says, "History says don't hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history can rhyme." So overall, Northern Ireland started this journey for hope and for justice 20 years ago in 1998. And I believe that now it's the time to continue this journey, but to finish it as a unified and a united community. And overall, we have to ask ourselves this essential question: what do we want Northern Irish society to look like in the next 20 years? Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. You see why we wanted young people on the panel today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, so my name is Claire Rumsa, and I'm really honoured to be here to represent the work of the Washington Ireland programme, and also share some of my experiences of growing up in Northern Ireland and the generation of peace. I will say we'd be recruiting you for WIP if you weren't already living over here after that introduction. I certainly couldn't have imagined 20 years ago that I'd be sitting here today, being given the opportunity to offer reflections on that momentous time. definitely still remember my mum calling me into the living room as a 14-year-old, giving away my age there, and to watch the TV to say, like, this is important, history is being made. And I remember watching the TV and observing a group of what looked like exhausted men and women, a lot of women there, who'd really gone through a lot to get to that stage. But even more relevant to me was looking at my parents, to see their face, kind of the cautious hope that they had, that things might be about to change. This is what they'd been hoping for and praying for and working for so long. My household growing up was a very political one. My dad is Catholic from County Cork in the Republic of Ireland, and my mum is Protestant from Northern Ireland. Let's just say that the conversations around the dinner table were always interesting. There were a lot of perspectives being offered, and to complicate matters, my mum became ordained in the Church of Ireland when I was a teenager. So let's just say that my Catholic grandmother didn't really get what she was praying for when she wanted a priest in the family. But I definitely think that God has a good sense of humour around this sort of thing. So certainly interesting. So I grew up in Northern Ireland as the child of what's known there as of a mixed marriage, which is interesting to look at what that means in different parts of the world. So I was naturally drawn to places and spaces that created opportunity for conversation, for togetherness, and dealing with the issues that were dividing us. Because I was like, where do I fit? I don't really fit well here, but I love Northern Ireland, and I want to make it a better place. That drew me to the Washington Ireland programme, and I'm a proud alumna of the class of 2004, and now I'm working leading the leadership programmes for the Washington Ireland programme, which is a huge honour. I love the job. I love working with the students and the emerging leaders from Northern Ireland and Ireland. For almost 25 years, the Washington Ireland programme has brought college students to the US who have the potential to shape the future of Northern Ireland and Ireland. Our students complete a challenging curriculum that's focused on them developing their own vision for the future, on them attaining a sensitive and rigorous understanding of what it means to follow the path of leadership, and importantly, on listening to the differing views of their peers. It's intentionally a crucible experience, and not just because we make the students wear suits in the middle of the DC summer. That's part of it, but there is, there's an intensity to the experience, to the conversations that we force them to have, to the difference that we intentionally build into the class, that brings the deeper insights, achieves the lasting bonds that we believe are key to building a better future for Northern Ireland and Ireland. Over the years, the Washington Ireland programme has become synonymous with the forging of friendships across different political perspectives, across community boundaries, and the emergence of a really unique all-Ireland network of leaders. We're always proud to talk about those alumni of the programme who are emerging as leaders in their chosen fields, and they are delivering on their early promise. And certainly we can point to the current Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, Ireland's youngest Taoiseach, and the class of 2000. The current Lord Mayor of Belfast, Nuala McAllister, just thinking back last week, giving the freedom of the city to President Bill Clinton and Senator George Mitchell. And seeing one of our students up there in that position was really a wonderful experience for us. Certainly a lot of pride in that. I find it really interesting to observe the differences in the conversations that are happening among the students on the Washington Ireland programme today compared to when I was a participant on the programme 14 years ago. Those conversations are changing, and that is a good thing. People in the class often describe themselves as peace babies, which makes me smile, but it's also like representative of something much greater and much more important in the fact that they are growing up and they have known relative peace. The stories and the stories from parents are stories. They're not part of the daily reality as well. And just growing up and living in Northern Ireland today, it is a very different place and a place that I'm really very proud to call home. We've come a really long way, and we've a huge amount to celebrate today. And the US undoubtedly played a really important role in the peace process and the formation of the Good Friday Agreement. And I think anyone from the US who will visit Northern Ireland will certainly feel that sense of very sincere gratitude for the role that was played and continues to be played. But also, just to reflect a little bit more on what you were saying as well, there's still a lot of work to be done. And what brought us here isn't necessarily what is going to get us to where we need to go. We need to be continually reimagining and being creative to the challenges that exist today, while also building upon the spirit and the foundation of the Good Friday Agreement. I would say that from my perspective, the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process has allowed people to live well separately, but I would argue that we haven't yet found a good way to live well together. The absence of violence is a huge achievement, and there are undoubtedly thousands of people who are alive today that wouldn't be had it not been for the peace process. But we need to go to the next step. Just even what Jared said in the opening about the otherness of the other, so finding ways to lessen that rather than accentuate it. And I think the current political stasis in Northern Ireland is really eroding a lot of the faith in the institutions that the agreement brought about. Unfortunately, we're seeing some increased disengagement from young people with the process, and this is really dangerous. That's something that we are really working very hard on. Something that we think is needed is almost like a renewal of the vows, so to speak, about where we're going as a society, and how we can nurture and encourage those who are ready to lead and to make those difficult decisions for the future. As you said as well, college is often the first place that young people in Northern Ireland are coming across people from the other community, being educated separately from elementary school through high school. We find that the Washington Ireland programme is often the first time that these bright, promising and very engaged young leaders from very different backgrounds from all parts of the island, it's the first time that they're having those deep and structured conversations with their peers on difficult issues. And those are the conversations that create that change, and the relationships, the friendships that go along with that encourage them to come back to the table and continue the conversation the next day. People are still trying to find a language about how to have these difficult conversations, and are still largely living separately. The context in which young people and the Washington Ireland programme students are growing up in is significantly shaped by our past. But we constantly work to find opportunities for them to be talking about what does the future look like. So we do a lot about creating the vision for what does the island of Ireland look like in 2040. We don't take a position on what that should look like, but we do want to make sure that those conversations and that vision is being crafted, and that it's being crafted with people that they disagree with from different political perspectives, different backgrounds, different religions. I'll never forget one day in June 2016 when the results of the Brexit vote came out. I'm sure everybody can all remember that day as well. But in my particular role and my responsibility for leading up the Washington Ireland programme, class of 2016 at that time, I had a group of 30 students who were away from home, students who thought entirely differently about whether the results of the Brexit vote were a good thing or a bad thing. And I walked into that room, and there was just, no matter what they thought, there was just a collective sense of shock and uncertainty, what is coming next. And certainly, we had a responsibility to try to convene a conversation around that, about how they can engage and continue to stay engaged in uncertain times. And as a result of that, we shifted our curriculum, and one of our core themes is leadership and resilience in uncertain times. And I think that's true for Northern Ireland, but true in a wider sense as well. We're committed, and it's just amazing to see it happen. We just need to make it happen on a bigger scale, to continue to find and create those spaces for new thinking to emerge, and importantly, in helping young people to take the first steps, to take the action that's needed to get us to the next stage in the process in Northern Ireland. Just reflecting on what Bruce Morrison said earlier, these are not hopeless situations. they recede with effort, and we're putting in the effort, and a lot of people in this room are part of that community as well, and we certainly have a lot to be proud of. I'm conscious, just as I wrap up my opening remarks, there was a sense of things coming full circle a little bit. Last week I was in Northern Ireland on the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, sitting in the same living room, but this time with my 2 small children who are under the age of 2. Just sitting there looking at where we come from, looking at where we want to go, and the sort of Northern Ireland that I want them to call a home going forward. It just really gave me kind of that renewed sense of perspective and focus and drive for the future, and something that I'm proud to carry on to my work every day as well. So if anybody here is looking for any small or big ways to keep that process going, certainly we're called the Washington Ireland Programme. We're based here, and we'd love to continue building that piece over here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So I have a quick question.
Yes.
Will your 2 children be here at Georgetown in 20 years for the 40th anniversary?
There we go. Yes, we'll book them in now. Yeah.
Matt.
Hello. So absolutely delighted to be here to speak with you all. I want to be upfront about a couple of things. First is I find it very hard to talk about this stuff without getting emotional, but I figured I'm going to do it anyway. And if I get a bit kind of, moved, or I'm just going to keep talking and kind of move through it. And the second is when I was trying to prepare remarks for this, I didn't really know what to say or where to start. At Studio Theatre, where I'm the Associate Artistic Director, I just opened a production of Translations by Brian Friel. So a lot of this has been on my mind. And there's one line in the play that I think sums up this whole problem of peace, which is the alcoholic schoolmaster Hugh, is reminiscing on the past and the impossibility of the future. And he says to his friend who might possibly have gone mad, my friend, confusion is not an ignoble condition. And I'm like, well, that's it, because I'm like, well, what do I talk about? Because I was born in 1981, so I'm very much not the generation of peace. And it means a lot to me to hear the hopefulness and forward focus of this kind of wave of youthful enthusiasm in Northern Ireland. But I find it very difficult to kind of process any feelings about peace without thinking about, well, what do we do with the past and the feelings of the past? And this is something that myself and many of my colleagues in the arts, that's our kind of bread and butter. And certainly this is really the question that Brian Friel was asking in 1980. In 1980, to talk about the present, he had to go back to 1833 to talk about maps and language. And then to do that play again and try and lead a group of American actors and artists through conversations about Northern Ireland, well, we're talking about maps, language, identity, 2 groups of people who can't find a common language, and we're like, well, that sounds very much like Washington in 2018. And the play's had a remarkable resonance, but it's kind of a weird, dislocating thing for me, being from Northern Ireland. And I'm somebody, I represent a secular middle-class upbringing. My family in Northern Ireland, I'm really grateful for this, we like to go on holiday to France and drink wine, and my dad liked to kind of listen to opera, and my family were very literate, and we would talk about kind of philosophy around the dinner table, and it's just a fairly standard middle class upbringing that I think anybody in any part of the world could relate to. And yet outside the door, there was very, very, very few mirrors back to me of myself and my identity. And this ultimately is kind of what I wanted to bring into the room today, is the idea that first of all, the Good Friday Agreement, peace, I'm a huge fan. The idea that you can walk down the street without getting attacked, that's just brilliant. Because, because in the 80s, I remember vividly, being told that someone was going to get me and being terrified of any car coming past me, someone was going to jump out and, beat me with a stick. And, and that was not some kind of youthful fantasy. That was the fact. And that's also not rare. I think any young man who grew up in Belfast in the 80s and early 90s, they're like, oh yeah, the stick, or yeah, I know that, or whatever other trauma, that they might be carrying. It's whenever you've got a a binary political opposition of two opposed identities. It shuts out the possibility of other identities existing. And doing youth theatre, sorry, no, yeah. I mean, that's the truth of it, is the trauma, like, you know, doing youth theatre, like a lot of my friends were gay. And, you know, what were they going to do? Because there was no room in the discourse of Northern Ireland to exist. And for all the kind of progress of the Good Friday Agreement, you know, that like there's certainly, in terms of social history, we're quite far behind a lot of the rest of the world even still. And this is what I think, peace. Well, maybe people can begin to just be who they want to be and not have other people tell them who they are, you know. And this is something I was reflecting on doing translations as well about because I left Belfast as quickly as I could, just because I couldn't cope with any of this stuff. So I lived in Dublin and Trinity, and then, you know, moved to New York for 10 years and then moved down here. And everywhere I go, there are still people who tell me who I am. You know, they want to explain Northern Ireland to me, particularly on St. Patrick's Day, which is why it's one of my least favorite days of the year, you know. And I remember there's one story. I was talking to Nelson Presley recently about translations, and I told him a story about when I was working on a film crew in New York with a bunch of Irish people. We all went out for whiskies. This was a big thing. We knocked off early on a Friday afternoon to go to a pub called the Bantry Bay, which is a famous place where people used to raise money for the IRA. And we had whiskies, and I ordered a Bushmills, and some big dude from Long Island says, "Put that down. That's Trader's whiskey." And I was like, so I'm a Northern Irish person, and someone who identifies as a Northern Irish Catholic, kind of culturally, even though I don't go to Mass and don't really know what that means. But I do enjoy like a bit of Bushmills now and again. Does that mean I am some kind of traitor? And if I'm a traitor, what am I a traitor to? Obviously, I didn't say any of this to him. I just said, no true Irishman lets politics get between him and his whiskey. And drank it, you know, which is another thing that us in the arts understand is the value of humour when faced with the bleakest of circumstances. And then everybody laughed, and he kind of stared at me, and, you know, nothing happened. But I was just considering, you know, like what peace means, and the way that symbols, stereotypes, identities become locked in and cannot move. And I wonder, you know, about all my like, what about the generations that didn't? Excuse me once again. Didn't get to decide, you know, like what if, like. I remember this was a playwright called Stuart Parker. I'm not sure if many of you know Stuart Parker. I remember going to see a production of Pentecost in the Lyric Theatre by Stuart Parker, and it opens, you know, and it's set on the evening of like sort of sectarian riots, and it opens with a guy playing the trombone, and he's trying to play along to like a jazz record from the American South. Yeah. And I was just like, what? That's not what Northern Irish theatre is supposed to be. It's supposed to be like Catholics and Protestants, Nuttons and Emmons, and then suddenly, yes, an angry Protestant ghost comes out and wants to get all the kind of Bohemian youth out of her townhouse, you know, so that history can take place. And then he wrote another play about Eurovision Song Contest writers. These two young writers, you know. Did anyone see that play? You know, Catch Me Twist, was that what it was called? I can't remember. Anyway, but I remember, like, it's full of these ridiculous Eurovision song parodies. And I was like, well, like that, and he exists in a very unique pocket of Northern Irish theatrical culture, in that he identified as a music-loving, hot press reading, European, like into films, into Jean-Luc Godard, wanted to kind of, you know, write articles, music journalism, that just, you know, kind of ended with him. And if you think that right now the Public Theatre in New York City is about to do a play by David Ireland, who's a young guy, younger than me, called Cypress Avenue. Stephen Ray's in it. And the premise of the play is that a guy believes that his granddaughter is, that is like 5-week-old granddaughter is a reincarnation of Jerry Adams. All right, so hilarious. And then they push it. But the play pushes it to the extreme of, if this baby is responsible for the IRA and 40 years of what do you do? And quite pretty shocking ending. As I'm sorry, it's ruined it for you. But think about a guy who's like in his early 30s, and the play that he wants to write, and he's closer to the generation of peace than I am, is about the impossibility of peace and the impossibility of these other identities existing. So that's what I kind of reflect on as somebody who kind of like grew up without peace, and then peace happened, and then had very, very, very little faith that it would stick, and very little faith in the politicians in Northern Ireland. I'm sorry if any of you are here, but you know, like the disappointment, was it too long a sacrifice makes a stone of the heart? You know, you're like, okay, here we are again. Oh, we broke down again. Oh, Stormont couldn't agree in the Irish language and it broke again 20 years later. Sure. Like, who's surprised? And I think that unless, and this really falls on you and your generation, like, unless you kind of find a way to forget, like, the intransigence of the past and open the field to new identities existing, like plurality over unity, like something about inclusiveness, a truly inclusive society, where the definition of like success is a democratic definition, and you know, perhaps there's some truth in this to the current American moment as well. The definition of a successful democracy is when people are able to be who they want to be without punishment, be who they want to be without kind of getting silenced or attacked in any way, shape, or form. And this is like when I go back home, you know, and all the plays that I get asked to do in Northern Ireland are about the Troubles, you know, about the trauma of the Troubles or about the past, you know. And I wonder about the effect of that trauma on the generation that came just after me, who didn't get their war.
Yeah.
You know.
So may I ask a,
Sure.
a
So I know it's a
slightly
bit
jocular
rambling, but
question
yeah.
before the...
Yeah, sure, please.
So the granddaughter who looks like Jerry Adams,
Yeah.
does she look like Mary Lou McDonald? Do you know who that is? Yes. I don't know if you can. Pardon?
It's not funny.
Yes. No.
Well, it's a question seriously, because if the plays that what you describe are plays written about, essentially that there's so many of them written about the Troubles, is there any thought that there can be a passing of the torch, and that things can change, and there can be women as leaders on both sides? There can be specific approaches to making things work, as you suggested.
Absolutely, and I think it all comes down to sort of individuals with great stories to tell, like leading it themselves. Like I think people leading the culture and not the other way around. And I think this is the transition that needs to happen. And that's something that as somebody who left, I feel I have a lot more agency over the types of Northern Irishness that I'm kind of allowed to express, or am able to express, or encouraged to express. You know, like I'm very careful about kind of what I get involved in. That's about the Troubles. But then in Northern Ireland, there are all these stories over the last kind of 40 years of playwrights who try and like just break the mold. And often women. I think one of my greatest heroes is Mary Jones, who wrote like Stones in His Pockets. You know, also was about the Troubles. But she was part of this company called Charabanc, which in the 80s, this group of Protestant women went into Catholic neighborhoods and gathered stories and then told those stories. And sometimes the stories weren't about the Troubles, they were just about working class life.
Exactly.
And their working class life in the past. And I think that things that celebrate people or celebrate the past in positive ways or celebrate family or stories allow us to see that there's so much more to Northern Ireland than peace or violence. There's just...
Than just to focus on the Troubles.
Than just to focus on the Troubles. I mean, I think it's also the responsibility of the people who produce plays to not say, no, we're not going to do the Troubles play, we're going to do something else.
Yeah, we have something else to do.
Yeah, because something else to talk about. Let's, you know, and there's a friend of mine who runs a theatre company in West Belfast called Brassneck, and they mainly do working class comedies, and every play they do is jammed. They extend. Sometimes they've taken plays from like a tiny working man's club, on the Falls Road to the Grand Opera House, because positive, uplifting, hilarious stories about working class life are like something that everybody's like, yes, please, thank you very much.
Exactly. Excellent. Thank you. So I have just a few questions, and I'd love to turn it over to the audience so they can engage with you. So one is, can you tell me what you each think about the role of women in the process in Good Friday Agreement, and now the role of women looking forward?
Yeah, I think women played such an important role in the Good Friday Agreement, and it's often a role that we forget. And even when I was looking on the coverage of the Good Friday Agreement just last Tuesday, I think women were the ones who were forgotten. I was looking, there was hardly anything about the role of Mo Molan, Secretary of State to Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, who at the time were silenced in the agreements while they had a role, but their voices were masked. And I do feel it's really important to reflect back on the role of women. Women like Brona Hines played such a critical role, and Georgetown actually has been fantastic in recognising them. The Institute for Women, Peace and Security have really gone to lengths to explore the role of women in conflict situations, and in particular the role that they can play in peace building, because it is proven that when women participate in peace building, those peace building settlements do last longer. So reflecting upon that, of course, it's essential that we increase the number of women in politics. Of course, it's fantastic that we have the two main largest parties in Northern Ireland led by women. But I do think that needs to be furthered. I think it's something like only 27% of elected representatives in Northern Ireland, members of the Legislative Assembly at the last election, were voted. And so we need to increase the share of women in participation and in governance. And I really do feel that will create more stability, more security, and like you say, a society that values individuals based on individual values. One of the key propositions of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition was that it was the only cross-community party that did not affiliate itself with nationalism or unionism, but instead it had a mandate based on equality of opportunity, and that's something that I think is really called for and is needed. And I think there's an opening actually in this particular time of instability.
Thank you.
So yeah, I think the Women's Coalition role has definitely been well covered there, and that's something that I was thinking about as well. Something that we're observing with the students that we're working with on the Washington Ireland program is like the emerging conversations around gender, and how that is, looking at the different experiences, the gendered roles that still exist very much in society, that this is a conversation that we need to be having about like the future of Northern Ireland and Ireland as well. So just thinking a little bit more about those other issues that really unite people, and create, I suppose, new conversations and new space. I wanted to reflect a little bit on something you'd said as well about like there's very few mirrors put up, for growing up, like mirrors put up to your own identity. That's something that we talk a lot about with the students too. Is like, what are our blind spots and how do we create more mirrors for our blind spots? And that language is taken directly from Anam Cara and John O'Donoghue, who I know will be well known to the people in this room too. But thinking about like creating more of those spaces where those blind spots are exposed, where those conversations are happening, and for those opportunities for new identities to emerge as well, whether that's on a gendered spectrum or class or whatever. It's
very important. Thank you. Matt.
Well, I think inclusion is the way forward. I mean, you just have to recognise everybody. And there's something that I learned from talking to Mary Jones and Eleanor Methven from Sharabank, is they were talking about how the idea of a violent man, the idea of a tough Northern Irish guy, even the phrase gunman, a gunman, like what that does to ideas of violence and peace. In many ways the violence is gendered, and I think that this creates a pathway, particularly like in masculine culture in Northern Ireland, towards confrontation. And what Mary and Eleanor told me is that often in the early days, one of the ways in which the women connected is that they paid the price. Mm-hmm. So the idea then that, it is not, there is no glory in peace, there's just the hard work and hard presence of kind of building it, kind of one agreement at a time. I think that the table should be as big as possible.
Thank you. Speaking of big as possible, how about youth involvement? And I'm reminded that nearly 50 years ago, Bernadette Devlin, when she was 22 years old, wrote what's considered by many a classic book, The Price of My Soul. And in it, she described what her view was of the Troubles. And by the way, as you know, her view was that they weren't really religious-based, that they were essentially economic-based, class-based, et cetera, that spoke to many of the issues that Congressman Morrison mentioned. But she was 22 years old, and that had rather significant influence. I wonder if you could talk about the role of youth in the future. Let's look to the future now.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think young people play a critical part in Northern Ireland's future, most essentially because they, as I've mentioned in my reflection, have not seen or experienced the violence directly. So what they have is a unique set of perspectives, but also strong opinions and a voice that needs to be heard within Northern Irish democracy. And I feel that that's represented in the sense that young people have strong opinions in the sense that I've been a part of many of the youth post-conflict projects. I've been involved in organisations like the UK Youth Parliament, Belfast City Council Youth Forum, the Children's Law Centre, and in all of these what I've gained is that young people have a different attitude and they're able to work across political and religious spectrums and have a cross-community strategy. They don't see politics as a zero-sum gain, as something that needs to be won and lost. I believe that their open-mindedness allows them to form compromises and negotiation, and that's something looking into the future that is without doubt needed. So those are some critical values that I feel that young people have and that they can offer back into and feed back into Northern Irish democracy. And I do feel that they have a critical role to play. And I also would say that it would be interesting to see more youth participation models. I think the Washington Ireland programme does a fantastic job at nurturing these young leaders in Northern Ireland, but I would love to see more programmes like that back home and really cultivating this new crop of young people who will lead Northern Ireland in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so something that it resonates actually with what you said too, is like, you know, with our students we talk a lot about telling your own story and not feeling that you're responsible to tell the story of your parents and the people who've gone before you. And certainly I think that's really what's needed, in my opinion, going forward, is to bring that fresh, creative, engaged perspective into the process. And as much as possible, like that's the work that we're doing, is trying to get as many of those new voices into the conversation as possible, so that it's not only the people who were involved in crafting the Good Friday Agreement and building the peace that are making the decisions at the table, but that we're also having these new voices in as well. And someone that we would point to as an example of this is Claire Sugden, who was appointed as Northern Ireland's Justice Minister at the age of 29. And the Justice Ministry is a very contentious ministry to take over. But the perspective that she was bringing, and actually the lack of baggage that she was able to bring to that, meant that she was able to make some more courageous decisions that perhaps those who had been more involved in, you know, the conflict in whatever way weren't able to do. So getting more of those voices around the table, making sure that the young people who are engaged and want to make a difference don't give up and don't leave, giving them a reason to stay. And making sure that they feel that their voice is being heard, because I think that's what's going to make the difference.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to briefly return to this, like the sad fact that young male suicide is huge. So, I mean, I think that you get two different types of youth response to growing up in a broken society. One is to grow up with like no faith in any of the institutions to fix society, so you got to do it yourself. And then the other is just to be lost, to have no map, you know. And I worry.
Yeah.
Thank you. I hope we have lots of questions from the audience. Yes.
Well, first of all, Hi, my name is Penny Hitchcock, and both sides of my family from Ireland, one from the north and one from the Republic. I'm delighted to hear you talk about the youth for several reasons. As you know, in our country, we have had a number of school episodes in which kids have been shot. That lesson has been taken to heart by these young people. We have 4 young people under the age of 18 running for governor in their states. They cannot vote, but they are going to run for governor because they're committed to change the world. We have the Peace Institute, founded by Larry Walker, who decided we were going to have Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. People were burying their kids, and it took him 6 months to get a nationwide program set up. He runs the Peace Institute right now, and he's helping these young people figure out how to use the system. So I think, and I spend enough time in Ireland to know about the energy that your kids have, I think that they are ready, always. If they're willing, they're ready to help with this. I want to talk about something not so nice that I think impacts on them in your country and in ours, and that is pedophilia. It's a huge problem. It's a problem that's not talked about. It's a problem that shuts kids down emotionally. It's a problem that the church has to deal with to some extent still. And I think we need to pay attention to that because we are basically stealing their courage, their faith, and their strength by allowing that to continue. So again, I can't thank you enough. I love the partnership, and we're in here to make the world better, and it starts with our kids. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Just a quick note to Claire. I'm a member of a mixed marriage as well, but in the United States now, my wife is a Republican, I'm a Democrat. So it's politically mixed, even though we're both Catholic. My question, though, I came into this program thinking I was going to ask your views on next steps to implement, to take it to the next stage of the Good Friday Agreement. But after listening particularly to Claire's comments and Matt's, it strikes me that maybe that's not the right question. I mean, maybe the question is, how do you create an environment, that is insulated from the divisive sort of political and religious nature of the past, create a safe environment where people can become themselves, and not be forced into one of these stereotype models. And in that way, maybe Ireland can, in fact, Northern Ireland can engage in a kind of process of self-realization collectively as its individuals are allowed to evolve and express themselves. It strikes me that maybe that's a way of going forward and implementing the Good Friday Agreement rather than looking at specific steps, trying to put forth or create a process by which those kind of steps can evolve naturally out of a safer and more forward-looking environment. Anyway, that's just a thought, and I'd appreciate any reaction you have to that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So I lived in Dublin for several years, and you hop on the train, and 2 hours later you hop off in Belfast. And when I went to college, it was the Celtic Tiger was booming, and Dublin just transformed into this forward-looking European city. There was cuisines from all over the world. Like people felt very free in many ways, certainly freer than in Northern Ireland to express themselves. And there was a kind of disdain for the backwardness of Northern Ireland. And I remember the first few times getting off the bus, and you feel the atmosphere shift as you go. The idea that Dublin counts itself alongside Lisbon or Paris or Cologne. Belfast is somehow not. Belfast is more in the land of depressed Northern English cities or something than in, and that kind of schizophrenia, particularly about Irishness, was something that was very, very, very confusing. And coupled with that, I have one very, very, very good friend from Dublin who has never been across the border. And I think that the idea of the way in which stereotype in the past constricts society, particularly when there is an omerta about some people who cannot be critiqued or who could can only be critiqued in certain specific ways, all these unspoken rules. So you have to dismantle that and allow people to kind of be free. And I do think that seeing I've got little sisters and my brother's got daughters, and seeing the kind of ways in which they're starting to kind of say, "No, this is crazy. We're not going to do this anymore." It's very, very, very encouraging. But it's like, what comes first, social change or political change? And I think that's not always very clear in Northern Ireland, where the loudest, most conservative voices are rewarded with the most political attention and power.
Yeah, just sort of to add on that a little bit as well, it's we literally just had a debate with the incoming group of students 2 weekends ago, and it was about free speech. But one of the themes that came out of that was that it's like it's not the ideas themselves that are dangerous, it's how we create the environment for those ideas and those views to be shared and discussed in a respectful and positive way. And I think that sort of is a microcosm of what we're trying to do as well, is to create more of those spaces for those conversations to happen in a way that's like constructive and, you know, like stepping out of the old identities of the past and thinking about, like, you know, well, where do we want to go from here? And what do we have, you know, what resources do we have within this room to make that happen? So I think, yeah, you know, and again, we're trying to convene more of those conversations outside of our immediate network as well, because if we're only working with 30 students a year, we're never going to have the impact that we want to have. So, you know, convening those larger conversations in Northern Ireland as well is something that we're really committed to as well. And just, again, giving more platforms for those new voices to be heard in the process, and saying, look, you can't ignore them, and we're going to keep talking until we're heard. So, yeah.
Claire, did you have a thought?
Yeah, and I just think it also starts with really simple questions and approaches. It's so many people have been dehumanized really because of the war, and it's about rebuilding that humanization. And I went to a conference when I was 14, and I remember I heard from a peace builder. His name was Ian White, and he was from Northern Ireland, but he had worked in places such as Israel, Palestine, Haiti, Afghanistan. And I remember he said, when building peace, that the most essential thing was speaking to somebody on very normal terms, getting them to sit down over a cup of coffee or a beer, and being able to have a conversation and ask, you know, where are you from? How many children do you have? What do they do? Just very simple questions that help to rehumanize people, to see them as individuals. And like Claire said, it's about opening up more platforms and vehicles to be able to do that.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks, great panel. I'm Jean Duff from Dublin. The most shocking figure that I think the panel has put out here is the 7% number that Francesca, you quoted. 7% of kids in integrated schools. That is absolutely shocking. I'd like to hear from each one of you with your great creative ideas for what it's going to take to blow that up.
Yeah, that has to involve both, I think, a religious and a political aspect. I think that the Catholic Church still has a major influence over schooling, and it would require a major pluralist agreement that involves both politics and religion. That is something that does prove difficult, but it is essential going forward. I don't know if I have a vision for it completely right now, but all I know is that it would need to encompass all of these aspects and all key stakeholders. Sorry, I don't have a more concrete resolution for you.
Yeah, great question. Actually, I sort of almost anticipated that this would come up today. I was chatting to a colleague about it too. I suppose to share my own perspective, I started off in an integrated school. It was very much in line with my parents' values about being educated together with people who were different. And I was removed from the integrated school because the quality of the education wasn't as good at that point, and I wouldn't say this is true now, as some of the other schools that were available to us in the area, which brings out an interesting thing about like people being willing to take that risk with their children's education. And the quality of the education in Northern Ireland is excellent for a lot of people, but not for everyone due to the academic selection process that exists. So how do we get past that? You know, because it's something that I believe in. I certainly do. I see the benefit of it with our students when they're coming together at third level university, college age, and in some ways that's too late too, right? Because there is that divisions, and we're overcoming more to have those conversations. Some of the things that I've seen that are, you know, early steps in the process are some of those shared campus spaces, you know, where schools from different sides of the community are sharing sports fields and like, you know, sharing teachers. It feels like that's a step in the process. Sometimes it would just, you know, from my own personal perspective, it could be great to just like change the whole system overnight, but I don't think that's going to be realistic either. I wish it was, I really do, but it's just like looking at that kind of heart pull of like my children's education, and do I want them to be the grand experiment? And I think that's something that is holding a lot of parents back from making that decision. I'm talking definitely from my own perspective here, not that of WIP, but I think it is the key to changing things as well. But where is the political will there? Is the, you know, a lot of the very powerful stakeholders in the conversation, as has been mentioned around the Catholic Church as well, like it would take a lot to shift that, but I think it would be really profound in terms of the impact that it would have.
Thank you.
Did we all go to integrated schools?
I went just for a few years.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
So we three are part of the 7%.
Well,
There you go.
can I count myself in that?
Yeah.
It's only for a few years, but yeah.
But just in terms of like all of us have pursued opportunities outside of Northern Ireland, because I think that like at the core of it, you know, and I think of it the principle of the question, I'm like, you know, absolutely we need to find a way to kind of, and I was like, well, what is the actual reason? And it's because most schools are in geographic regions where everybody shares the same. Yeah. So what you're, like the idea of integration is not, let's integrate the schools. It's, well, what are the school districts? Because, you know, I grew up in North Belfast, which is just a patchwork. And you've got, like, I remember like the boys model in Ballysillan, and all the guys from Ballysillan go to the boys model. And then St. Malachy's and everybody, you know, like in the Catholic neighbourhoods, from, you know, the New Lodge goes to St. Malachy's, and there's a little bit of kind of travelling around, but I think so much of your identity is handed to you by accident of birth, including where you go to school, where you go to church, what the cultural norms of your family are. You know, like I'm always struck that we've got this whole thing about Rangers and Celtic in Northern Ireland, you know, and you know, it always struck me when walking through town seeing a baby in a Rangers jersey or a Celtic jersey, how this was sort of like a kind of like predestining of the next 20 years of their existence. You know, this one by associating with the symbols in the tribe. So I don't see a very easy way out of it, because you got the church who kind of has such a grip on Catholic education, and then councils and how, like, the political question over who represents which ward and what their schools are like, and to unpack it is to unpack the entire problem, the entire system. So I mean, unless you just sort of start again, it's hard to see a way that doesn't take 70 years.
Excellent question. You have another question?
No, that was my question. I have one. I read 2 weeks ago that, you know, the number for the 37 years of the Troubles is 3,600 people killed. And in the last 20 years, 4,200 people have committed suicide. And I know they're doing a lot with hotlines and everything like that, but it's just the reflection of what the 37 years of the Troubles did to people's mental health. So there's no question.
No.
That's a striking thing, suicide. You? Two questions over here? Yes.
So I don't know that I have a question as much as a couple of observations, but I really enjoyed the 3 presentations, multi-generational aspect. So I've had the pleasure of hosting Claire's students for 3 years, and it's really been interesting to me. So I'm Irish American, and so I look at it, you know, from many generations past. So I used to enjoy traveling to Ireland, but never the North. The North is really a very interesting place. I did that recently, and I visited all my students. And one observation is that the students from the Republic are much less aware of kind of what's happening on their island, whereas I think the students from the North are they're very much aware of it. Many of the students, and so we have the opportunity as host parents to interact with all 30 each year. They're really interested in international development issues, solving these problems from afar. And so, but then I'm not sure how much the students from the Republic could really contribute to solving problems in the North, but at least a better awareness. That's one thing that surprised me. I knew I was learning more about Northern Ireland, but I think some of them were learning. So, and then the other observation is I've really appreciated your observation about I was moved by your observation about what it must feel like to have to grow up choosing. You're either this or you're that, and how limiting that is. I had, grown up in South Florida, the opportunity, you never thought about that. So I wonder if focusing on that, maybe you do that in the WIP program already, like at a personal level, how limiting that is because I think you do have to talk about the past and as you move forward, but you want to get past it quickly, maybe. And so maybe that's a place to begin. And I also worry, as I have some 20-something children and I'm close with my nieces and nephews, I almost feel like we're going that way in this country. Like when they're on somebody's Facebook page, he's Republican, so I, defriended them or, whatever, unfriended them. And so I wonder, the whole time you were talking, just because I'm U.S. and think U.S., I'm wondering if we're almost recreating some of these historical relationships you have in the North. So, again, no question, but just really appreciated your comments.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. I guess this is sort of addressed to Matt Torney. Recently, I like to write too, and I'm connected with Villanova University, and we have there a number of Humboldt Chair writers that spend a semester on campus. And recently there was a writer and a filmmaker, and they're both from Derry. And so Colette Bryce is the poet who writes a lot about Northern Ireland and her childhood. She was raised in the 80s. And then Colin Broderick is a filmmaker. And they met one another for the first time at Villanova, and I overheard this conversation where they said, well, and they were about the same age, maybe she was about the same age. They had to get out of Derry. They were raised in the 80s and the early 90s, and there was no future for them as writers there. And they instantly understood that. Oh, yes, we got out. Colette went to school in London, and she goes back to Northern Ireland, but doesn't ever intend to live there again. Mm-hmm. Colin goes back and visits his family, but doesn't feel he has a home as an artist there, although they both write about Northern Ireland. So artists are the conscience of a people. Do you see a future for artists staying in Ireland, or is there a brain drain of writers out of Ireland? Who are the current people writing and getting the soul of Ireland?
Yeah, there's a couple of answers to the question. One of them is practical, which is that arts funding in Ireland just keeps getting cut and cut and cut and cut and cut again. Like the Northern Irish Arts Council was cut some ridiculous 50% in the last few years. Mm. So just to speak to the opportunities available, whether or not you want to write about the Troubles or anything, when I was a student at Trinity, there was 10 or 15 theatre companies in the Republic of Ireland who would also support Northern Irish artists, who would do new plays. Now there's 3. So if you're a playwright, you got to leave because no one's going to do your plays. And I know that I felt that the type of kind of theatre I wanted to make and the way I wanted to make it, the opportunities did not exist in Dublin or Belfast at the time. So I had a choice, which was London or New York. And I chose New York, and that kind of like created the next kind of like pattern of my life. But it's something I hear all the time from people who stayed, is unless you raise money and make it yourself, there's no outlet for your work. And I meet Irish artists, both in the north and south, all the time, who live over here and work over here, or live in London and work in London. And very, very, very rarely does anybody want to go back except for one, to see the family or do one play or do one show. Yeah. And I think it's like if the artists are the conscience of the people, and certainly thinking about Brian Friel and Field Day, this is something that was understood in 1980, that artists could come together and form what was called a fifth province, the 4 provinces of Ireland, and then an additional province of the intellectual, emotional, spiritual imagination of the people. That then, because what art can do that politics can't is process ambiguity. Politics, you have a political position that you argue and represent. In art, you can have both and more, and it all sits there in the mess, the human mess. But artists also are human beings who need to like eat. As much as, we're called starving, like not to death. And I think that is something that has been forgotten by people in government in Ireland, North and South. And if they don't change it, the brain drain will continue.
So thank you so much. I have one final quick question because we're running out of time.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine it's 2038 and we're commemorating / celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And you're interviewed. You're, of course, key leaders in Northern Ireland. And you're interviewed and you have a 1-sentence statement to make about 40 years after.
Okay. Ooh, that's tough. So I would envision in 2038 a society where individuals are valued not in terms of their religious or their political affiliations, but we have a community of cohesion between social, cultural, political and religious lines, and there's a balancing of these.
Wonderful. Francesca.
So 2038, and it's funny because we make the students do this. We go, what's your vision for 2040? And I'm like, I love watching it, but having to actually do it myself is obviously a different process. I would love in 2038 to be saying we are the success story. Northern Ireland is the best place in the world to live and work and bring up a family, and that Northern Ireland is continuing to be that shining light that others relate to and aspire to be as well. And that's what we're working towards. So we're halfway there.
Thank you. Wonderful.
And I would say that political peace is not enough. We must pursue personal peace.
Wonderful. And we are very confident that each of you will contribute to that future. Thank you.
Thank you.